Hey, welcome back. I'm Sean Barr, and at Looking Point, we help IT organizations make decisions around collaboration, security, and networking. Today, we're going to be talking about the room kit and some of the things you need to think about when building your room when it comes to wiring. Let's go! All right, we're back, and we are talking about the room kit, and this is a room kit plus codec and a quad camera. And we got a lot of comments on our YouTube channel around, hey, can you cover the wiring related to these room setups or these room kits? And that's what we're going to do today. Now, obviously, we're not going to cover every aspect for every room, but we're going to give you the high-level overview of the wiring and things you should consider when building one of these room kits. So I'm going to move this camera out of the way, over here somewhere, and let's start with the codec. Now, this is a codec plus. There's a Pro, and we did a bunch of videos on all the different versions, but we're going to be going over the Plus, and the concepts will all be the same related to the codec. The connections, when we get to the mics and the speakers, may be a little bit different, but the concepts are all the same. So let's start with the codec here. Now, along the back, I'm going to just start from my right, which is probably your left, and I'm going to work my way this way on the codec. So the first point here is just the on-off switch, and that's just to turn it on and off. The next thing is the power button, or the power connector, not the button, but the power connector, which you'll connect the power to. There's a lock in case that you're putting it in a room that maybe is exposed to public access and you don't want somebody walking off with it. You can lock the unit. As well as the network jacks. Now, there's a number of these. There's one for the Touch 10, which can be connected here, and it'll provide PoE to the touch panel. You've got a network port, which will allow you to connect it, obviously, to the network. And then the third port is for the camera. And so essentially what they're doing with this is allowing you to bring one connection into the room for the codec, and it'll share it with the touch panel. It'll also share it with the camera. Now, if you wanted to, the Touch 10, you could connect it into a switch that has network reachability to the codec, and they could pair over the network. That's pretty simple, and we do that quite a bit. But if you wanted to save on network ports, you can just plug it directly into the codec. It just depends on the wiring of your environment. The next thing is the camera port. Now, this is the HDMI connection that goes from the codec to the camera. Then we've got inputs. This is input 2 and input, it looks like input 3. These are two inputs that can be used for your laptops, or if you had a computer in the room, you could connect it here, and that would just be an input that you would select on the Touch 10 if you wanted to share the screen, or if you wanted to just display it up on the TVs that you have in the room. The next area is or the next two HDMI ports are for the TVs or the displays. Now, these could be connected to one or two displays, and then there's a bunch of settings on layouts for the codec of how you want those displays to be used. These codecs support CEC, which is the ability to remotely turn off and on the display based on a signal that it sends out of the HDMI port. So when you walk into the room and you touch a Touch 10, if your display supports CEC and it's turned on, the displays will turn on automatically, and you don't need an automation system to do that. It's just going to be controlled through the HDMI. We've got some USB maintenance ports here. We've got microphone ports here, and we've got a speaker output here. Now, these are traditional, like a headphone style jack. You'll see Phoenix connectors on some of the larger codecs, but essentially you're going to plug in your microphones into these ports, and you're going to plug in your speaker output, or if you have an amp, you're going to plug that in here, and you can plug it into an amp. The amp will run the speakers. Now, in the quad camera that we're using, there are speakers built into the quad cam, so if you don't want to use, or you don't need audio reinforcement, you could just use the speakers in the quad camera. The microphones typically in a room will either use table mics or ceiling mics, and the table mics work really great. You'll plug them directly into here, put them on the table, and you're in business. They'll have a mute button. That'll all work through here. If you use in-ceiling microphones, Cisco makes one. There's also aftermarket microphone arrays that you can use. What we found for the best deployment is just to use the Cisco table mics. It's the easiest installation if you're doing it on your own, if you're not going to use an integrator. Using the table mics and just plugging them in individually into these microphone inputs, that's going to work for most size rooms. The speaker output, if you want audio reinforcement, again, that's going to plug into an amplifier. The amplifier is going to run the speakers in the ceiling. And so that's it at a very high level on the connections. Let's talk about some of the details. So when you are connecting HDMI connections for connections to either an input like a computer or an output to a display, or from a codec, from the codec to the camera, or from the camera to the codec, you'll want to use HDMI 2.1 cables if possible. We found just that they're the best cables to use for this type of a setup, and we don't really have any negotiation issues with good quality HDMI 2.1 cables. Now, in some cases, you may not be able to get an HDMI cable from the codec to maybe the table or the room that you're in. You may not be able to get an HDMI cable from the codec to the display or to the camera, and you may use a balun. That is fine. You can use baluns. I would say you should test those baluns before you put them in place. You'll want to get a high quality balun because sometimes there's negotiation issues with the displays or with your laptop, and so if you have those issues where you plug in a laptop and it's not recognizing it and you're using a balun, it may be a balun type issue. So we would recommend for all of our installs, we want to get an HDMI cable in there, if at all possible, a 2.1. And a lot of times these cables are directional. And so that's really for ARC, and there's a lot of people that make comments on if it really matters or doesn't matter, and it's just attenuation or whatever. If you've got directional based cables, get the direction right. I think it's just best practice, and you want to pay attention to it. And so what that means is when you look at the actual cable ends, they're going to have an arrow that's going to point out or in. And so as an example, if it is a display, it will be the in arrow, the arrow pointing towards the cable will go on this side because it's a display out, and then it'll plug into the TV with the arrow out to the display. If it's an input, the arrow will be facing away or out the cable, and then at the desk, it'll be an input arrow. And so that'll ensure that you're aligning those directional cables in the right way. It is a best practice. It could probably work fine if you get it backwards. I would just say, hey, let's get the cables in the direction that they were designed for. Okay, so now let's move on to the quad camera. And so we've got our codec now connected to all the cables. We've got it connected to the Touch 10 and all that stuff. Now we're moving to the quad camera. And so on the back of the quad camera, there's really three things that you need to think about for the quad camera. You're going to need an HDMI cable. You're going to need a RJ45 Cat6 cable, Cat5e, that goes from the camera to the codec. You're going to need the HDMI connection that sends the video signal that it's picking up from the camera out to the codec. And then you're also going to need a power connection. Now you'll notice that there's a little power plug and there's an on-off switch here. That may not be an on-off switch. Oh yeah, it is. It's an on-off switch. I just want to make sure. It's an on-off switch. And so power is something that's overlooked a lot of times when it comes to the camera. And so wherever you have those displays and you have the camera, you're going to want the ability to get power to this unit. Now, you could put an outlet behind the TVs and have a way to fish the cable here and plug it in behind the TV. That would be probably the preferred way. These cameras have a brick with a connector, a power connector on one side, and then the small 12 volt or low voltage DC type connector on the other side. And typically there's a brick in the middle. Now that brick, you'll want to try to hide that. And so putting it behind a TV with the power plug and then fishing the extension wire down to the camera is a nice way to do it. So you just want to think about the length of cable, where you're going to have the power connection, and making sure that you can fit. Some of those have the little round, I don't remember what they're called, like an attenuator, or basically that hangs on the end of a DC connection. Sometimes you'll have to think about getting that through a conduit. So just want to think through those things. Same with HDMI cables. The end of an HDMI cable could be a little thicker. So you want to think about that, making sure that you have access to those cables so that when you plug them in, you can put it on the wall and you can do your best to kind of dress it up and hide those cables as they go into the wall for your setup. And so really that's it from a camera standpoint. Power, Ethernet, HDMI. And just thinking through those things and doing a little bit of planning will save you a lot of headache as you're installing these systems. So I think I covered pretty much all the basics when it comes to cabling setup, things about HDMI cables and their direction, where to have power, audio reinforcement at a very basic level. So that should be enough to get you started on a basic room and just the overall cabling configuration for these units. If I said anything in this video that you're like, hey, I want to know more about that, make sure you leave a comment. Make sure you like and subscribe so you get all of our content as we release it. And we will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.